They weren't heroes. They were human weapons raised to kill without mercy, built to rule through fear. Sparta, the name echoes glory in movies. Bronze shields, red cloaks, men who die for honor. But behind the myth lies something far more terrifying. This was a society that turned children into predators, mothers into state agents, and mass murder into ritual. They didn't just enslave a people. They built a civilization where torture was sacred, empathy was a crime, and cruelty was a way of life. This is the story of the real Sparta, not the one Hollywood sold you, but the one buried beneath centuries of blood and silence. What you're about to hear will make modern dictatorships look merciful. When people think of ancient Sparta, they don't see blood. They see bronze. They see rippling muscles, red cloaks, phalanx formations, and noble warriors sacrificing themselves for freedom. They see the myth, fed to them by centuries of poetry, propaganda, and Hollywood. The tale of 300 men who stood against 1,000,000. Discipline, honor, bravery, brotherhood. But beneath that polished armor is rot. This isn't the story of heroes. This is the true history of a civilization that turned human suffering into ritual. A society that perfected the machinery of state terror, centuries before the word dictator even existed. Where children were beaten, starved, broken, so they could one day kill their fellow man without mercy. Where entire populations were enslaved, hunted, and exterminated under the guise of law, order, and divinely sanctioned superiority. The Spartans didn't just glorify war, they industrialized it. And the first victims? Their neighbors. Around 1000 BCE, as the Bronze Age collapsed and great civilizations fell into ruin, four small villages in the valley of Laconia made a pact. But this wasn't a peaceful alliance. This was war-born pragmatism. These people weren't farmers. They were warriors displaced by chaos. Hardened men carrying the genetic memory of conquest. Their union gave birth to Sparta. And unlike Athens or Thebes, cities where philosophy, commerce, and creativity mingled with war, Sparta was different. Sparta was pure, unfiltered. A human engine built for one purpose only: dominance. Every law, every custom, every ritual served a single agenda: to maintain a brutal ruling class and to crush anyone who threatened it. The myth says it was the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus who forged this iron society. Some say he was real. Others, a political myth. But real or not, Lycurgus' so-called reforms reshaped the new Spartan state into a rigid, militarized caste system. A living machine fueled by fear. Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, were a tiny elite. Beneath them lived the Perioeci, free non-citizens who did the trades and crafts. And beneath them, the Helots. They were the foundation of everything. Enslaved from the conquered Messenian people, the Helots vastly outnumbered the Spartans. 10-1. Farmers, laborers, servants, a subjugated population bound to the land, forbidden to leave, forbidden to fight, forbidden to live as humans. And the Spartans feared them. Not just feared, obsessed over them. Because the entire Spartan system was built on the Helots' backs. If the Helots ever rose up, the Spartan way of life would collapse overnight. So the solution wasn't compromise. It wasn't reform. It was terror. Every year, the 5 elected ephors, the most powerful men in Spartan politics, made a formal declaration of war against the Helots. Not metaphorical war. Not a figure of speech. Actual war. This declaration made it legal for any Spartan to kill a Helot, without trial, without question, without guilt. It wasn't just permitted. It was encouraged. Sacred. Righteous. It was genocide baked into the law. Young Spartans were trained to stalk, hunt, and kill Helots as part of their military education. The state called it the Krypteia, a secret police of teenage assassins sent into the countryside, cloaked in darkness, armed with nothing but daggers and discipline. Their mission: find the most intelligent, the most defiant, the most charismatic Helots, and kill them. These weren't acts of war. They were ritualized murder. A slow, grinding campaign of psychological destruction, ensuring the enslaved population never knew safety, never knew hope, never knew rebellion. And the most twisted part? The Spartans saw this as justice. They believed the Helots were naturally inferior, born to serve. Not just enemies but subhuman, vermin. And through relentless ritual degradation, the Helots were forced to participate in their own dehumanization. They were made to sing songs mocking their slavery. They were forced to wear dogskin caps and rough tunics, markers of their permanent humiliation. They were beaten, humiliated, spat on in public, and paraded before Spartan children as object lessons in disgrace. It was cruelty dressed as education. Oppression cloaked in ceremony. The Spartans didn't just enslave people. They rewrote the very definition of humanity, making helots believe they didn't deserve freedom. That suffering was their role in the cosmos. And this was just the beginning. Perhaps no institution better embodied Spartan cruelty than the Krypteia, a state-sanctioned death squad masquerading as a coming-of-age ritual. On the surface, it was a test of endurance and independence for elite Spartan youths. In truth, it was an initiation into a cult of sanctioned murder. Boys around the age of 20 were chosen for their cunning, their ruthlessness, and their capacity to kill without remorse. Armed with nothing but daggers, they were sent into the countryside under cover of darkness with a single directive: hunt helots. These young assassins were trained to stalk human prey like animals, studying their routines, identifying potential leaders, and striking when least expected. Strong, clever, and charismatic helots were marked for elimination. The point wasn't just to kill, it was to terrorize, to make leadership itself a death sentence. Bodies were left in public view or never found at all. Entire families lived in the agony of silence, unsure whether a loved one had fled or been butchered. But the true horror wasn't the killing itself. It was what came after. The Krypteia wasn't a phase. It was a factory for creating lifelong monsters. Those who survived didn't return broken. They came back proud, congratulated for their effectiveness in state-sanctioned murder. Many went on to become future leaders. Men molded by a system that taught them the state was holy, murder was sacred, and empathy was treason. Yet even the Krypteia was just one cog in a far more horrifying machine: the Agoge. The Agoge wasn't a school. It was an indoctrination camp disguised as an education system. A 20-year program designed to destroy the soul and rebuild it in Sparta's image. Children as young as 7 were ripped from their families, cast into a brutal world where survival meant domination. From the first day, the boys were underfed, beaten, and forced to steal. Not because theft was acceptable, but because failure to get away with it meant punishment. They slept on beds made from their own hands, wore the same cloak year-round, and endured cold, sickness, and hunger as tests of loyalty. Crying was weakness. Kindness was betrayal. Compassion was a disease to be eradicated. They were taught to hate weakness in all forms, in others and in themselves. But the physical abuse was just the surface. The true rot ran deeper: psychological warfare. These children were forced to witness, and eventually perform, acts of grotesque cruelty against helots. Torture. Humiliation. Even execution. They were taught to laugh at suffering and to admire strength without morality. The line between monster and man was blurred until nothing human remained. Even more disturbing was how Sparta turned victim into perpetrator. Older boys were given power over younger ones, turning classmates into abusers. This hierarchy of torment ensured that by the time a child became a man, he had not only endured horror, he had inflicted it. That was the real lesson: brutality binds you to the system, and guilt keeps you loyal. When these boys grew up, they weren't men, they were weapons. Emotionless, merciless, engineered. And when their training was done, their torment didn't end. It simply shifted form. Every night, they sat down to what should have been a moment of peace: the Spartan communal meal or syssitia. But these weren't brotherly gatherings. They were psychological battlegrounds. These meals were ceremonies of surveillance, where your words were ammunition and your silence was suspicion. Every man present knew that the wrong comment, a moment of doubt, a flicker of compassion, could lead to exile or worse. Failure to meet food quotas meant ejection. Ejection meant the death of your identity. In Sparta, to be expelled from your group was to cease existing. And it was in these twisted dinners that the seeds of the Krypteia were sown. Young men were watched for their coldness, their willingness to humiliate, their eagerness to kill. Those who hesitated, who joked too kindly, who asked the wrong questions, were marked. Sparta's iron grip didn't just control the body. It engineered the mind, shaping each citizen into both jailer and prisoner. And yet, in all of this, something even darker was growing behind the scenes. Spartan women, often praised by modern commentators as liberated, were actually living under a cold, clinical regime of state-controlled reproduction. These women weren't free, they were livestock. Every breath they took, every step they walked, was part of a machine obsessed with eugenics and military breeding. They were forced to exercise, diet, and live under the scrutiny of a society that saw them not as people but as wombs. Love had no place here. Husbands were not allowed to live with their wives. They visited only in secrecy, a strategy designed not for romance but for heightened fertility. If a woman didn't conceive quickly enough, she could be reassigned, like breeding cattle, to a man with better stock. And if she dared to mourn her son's death in battle, public shame. Her grief was treason. Her tears were sin. The brutality of Spartan society didn't begin on the battlefield. It began in childhood, in a state-sponsored crucible of pain known as the agoge. It was here, at just 7 years old, that Spartan boys were torn from their mothers and marched into a system designed to crush the human spirit and forge a weapon in its place. This wasn't education. It was psychological warfare, against children. The agoge wasn't a school. It was a 20-year indoctrination program where compassion was a punishable offense, and empathy was treated like a disease. From the moment they entered, boys were thrown into a world that rewarded cruelty and punished conscience. They were deliberately underfed, encouraged to steal food to survive. And when they got caught, not for stealing but for being careless, they were beaten mercilessly. Not just as punishment but as training. They slept on beds made of reeds they had to cut with their bare hands. They wore the same coarse cloak year-round, whether freezing in the Spartan winter or sweating under the blistering sun. Warmth was considered weakness. And pain? That was a teacher. Crying, complaining, or showing any sign of suffering was met with swift and brutal correction. Children who faltered were beaten in front of their peers, their pain turned into a warning. Those who showed kindness were humiliated, or worse. And always watching were the older boys, already twisted by years of indoctrination, now given authority over their juniors. This wasn't mentorship. It was sanctioned abuse. A hierarchy of pain. Victims became perpetrators just as their abusers had before them. By the time a boy became a man, he had not only endured horror, he had delivered it. He had learned that cruelty wasn't just necessary. It was righteous. Worse still were the public rituals. To teach obedience, Spartan children were forced to participate in the humiliation of the helots, the enslaved underclass they were taught to despise. Some were made to watch as helots were paraded drunk and mocked. Others were instructed to beat them, or even kill them, as part of their training. It wasn't just brutality. It was conditioning. A child who could learn to laugh while taking a life could later kill without hesitation. And the program worked. By adulthood, a Spartan male was no longer fully human. He was a product, engineered by the state to follow orders, to execute atrocities without guilt, and to see compassion as betrayal. This wasn't accidental. It was the point. The agoge didn't build warriors. It dismantled individuals and replaced them with instruments, living weapons designed to serve the state without question or morality. These weren't just trained soldiers. They were indoctrinated machines of discipline and death. And once they graduated, the torment didn't stop. Each man joined the syssitia, the infamous communal mess halls of Spartan society. But these weren't places of camaraderie. They were war zones, political battlegrounds disguised as mealtimes. Here, every word spoken was monitored. Every joke, every comment, every gesture, evaluated. Men were expected to contribute food, wine, and resources. Those who couldn't? Expelled. Cast out of society. Stripped of identity. The threat of exile wasn't just symbolic. In Sparta, to be rejected was to be erased. And the conversations? They weren't friendly. They were tests, brutal contests of wit and dominance. A single wrong phrase could mean social death. Any hint of softness, doubt, or disagreement with the Spartan ideal was noted, reported, used. Even at the dinner table, fear ruled everything. The syssitia also served another purpose: surveillance and recruitment. It was here that the state's secret police, the Krypteia, watched for signs of weakness. Men who showed too much empathy were marked, tracked, removed. It was a society engineered for conformity and terror, where silence could save you and honesty could destroy you. And while the men suffered under this rigid machine, the women of Sparta were forced into a different kind of hell, one cloaked in freedom but rooted in control. In modern narratives, Spartan women are often glorified, painted as early feminists in a world of male dominance. Strong, free, proud. But peel back the myth and what you'll find is something far more disturbing. These weren't liberated citizens. They were state-managed wombs, tools in a cold experiment of eugenics and population engineering. Yes, Spartan women had more mobility than their Athenian counterparts. But this wasn't freedom. It was utility. From childhood, girls were trained, not to think, not to lead, but to breed. Physical training wasn't about personal empowerment. It was national strategy. Healthy girls produced healthy boys, and healthy boys meant stronger soldiers. Their bodies weren't their own. Their strength was not for themselves. They were vessels, biological resources for the machinery of war. Marriage in Sparta was not about love. It was not even about family. It was policy. Couples were deliberately separated. Husbands lived in military barracks, allowed to visit their wives only at night, in secret like trespassers in their own homes. What? To increase sexual desire. To maximize pregnancy rates. The state dictated when, how, and with whom conception should occur, all for the sacred mission of breeding warriors. If a woman failed to produce children, she was interrogated. Her sex life evaluated. Her compatibility with her husband questioned. And if deemed unfit, she could be reassigned, like livestock, to another male partner more genetically promising. This wasn't marriage. It was institutionalized human breeding, justified through a twisted lens of civic duty. But perhaps the most chilling role women played wasn't reproductive. It was emotional, the indoctrination of sacrifice. Spartan mothers were expected to cheer when their sons marched off to die. To weep was shame. To mourn was treason. A mother who cried over a fallen child risked public disgrace. Her grief was proof of weakness, proof that she loved too much, that she valued life more than death, emotion more than duty. In a society where compassion was treasonous, even a mother's tears were crimes. Women were praised not for raising kind, intelligent children, but for producing obedient killers. If her son died in battle, she was honored. If he came home alive after retreating, she was disgraced. The state had so thoroughly corrupted maternal instinct that joy over a son's death was seen as the highest form of patriotism. This wasn't feminism. This was emotional mutilation. Spartan women were not empowered. They were weaponized. And at the foundation of it all, at the root of this dystopian reproduction factory, was the most horrifying ritual of all, state-sanctioned infanticide. The myth says Sparta was a nation of strength. The truth? Sparta was a nation at war with weakness, even if that weakness came swaddled in cloth, breathing its first breath. At birth, every Spartan child faced a silent trial. Not of skill. Not of intelligence. Of genetics. The newborns weren't placed in cradles. They were placed before inspectors, ephors and elders appointed by the state. Their job wasn't to admire the miracle of life. It was to judge whether it deserved to continue. Did the baby cry too much? Was it too small? Did it flinch oddly, seem soft, or bear even the slightest hint of deformity? Execution. Not by sword. Not by poison. But by abandonment, exposure. Condemned infants were taken to the cliffs of Mount Taygetus and left to die. No grave. No name. No dignity. Just the cold wind and the mouths of wild animals. These weren't rare cases. This was policy, a eugenics program thousands of years before the word even existed. And if parents wept? If they begged to keep the child? They were suspected of disloyalty, of weakness, of treason. They learned quickly to celebrate the death of their own blood. To smile as strangers carried their newborns away to the mountain of bones. This wasn't mercy. It was optimization. The Spartans claimed these killings were acts of compassion, sparing the child a life of hardship. But that was a lie. These murders weren't for the child. They were for the state. To purge any life that didn't serve the war machine. And the propaganda ran deep. Over time, parents began to believe it. They whispered, "It's better this way." They convinced themselves that death was noble, that rejection was moral, that killing was kindness. And in doing so, they didn't just bury their children. They buried their humanity. But it didn't stop there. The state's reach extended to every stage of life. If you survived infancy, your next torment began at 7, the agoge. We've already seen the cruelty of Spartan childhood, but remember this, the agoge wasn't just a school. It was the continuation of infanticide by other means, a psychological culling of compassion, empathy, and resistance. By the time a boy reached manhood, he no longer recognized mercy. He didn't remember the soft voice of his mother. He only knew orders, scars, and blood. His own hands had become the mountain. His soul, exposed. This is what made Sparta so effective, and so monstrous. It wasn't just the killing. It was the systematic transformation of the human heart into a cold, mechanical engine of cruelty. From crib to cliff, from classroom to battlefield, Spartans were raised to believe that survival meant sacrifice. Not of yourself but of everyone else. Even your own children. When most people picture ancient economies, they imagine bustling marketplaces, merchant ships, and coins exchanging hands. But Sparta's economy had none of that. No silver coins clinking in crowded agoras. No merchants bargaining over olive oil. Sparta's wealth wasn't built through trade or innovation. It was built through enslavement, an economy powered by human suffering. At the heart of it all were the helots, the enslaved people who made up the majority of Sparta's population. They weren't just servants. They were the foundation, the blood and bone of Spartan prosperity. Every field plowed, every harvest collected, every loaf of bread baked, it all came from their hands under threat of death. Spartan citizens owned the land but never worked it. That was beneath them. Instead, they extracted wealth from the helots like parasites feeding on a host. Helots were required by law to hand over the majority of their crops to their Spartan masters, regardless of drought, pestilence, or famine. If the harvest was poor, too bad. The quota stayed the same. And if they failed to meet it? Whippings, executions, disappearances. There was no margin for error. No appeal. The Spartans had built a perfect system of exploitation, one that didn't just steal labor, but ensured that the helots remained too weak, too afraid, and too isolated to ever organize resistance. They were banned from owning weapons, forbidden from learning to read, not allowed to travel without permission. They couldn't gather in large numbers and they couldn't speak against their masters. It was a prison without walls, and the guards were everywhere. And the Spartans? They cloaked this savagery in religion, claimed the gods had decreed their dominance, that the helots were born inferior, divinely destined to serve. Rituals were held where helots were mocked, humiliated, and forced to praise their captors. Festivals were thrown in which Spartans celebrated the system that kept them fat, free, and feared. It was psychological warfare dressed as spiritual tradition, and the victims had no choice but to sing along. But the worst part wasn't just how the helots were treated. It was how effective the system was. Unlike other slave societies that risked uprisings or collapse, Sparta's control was so absolute, so total, that rebellion was nearly impossible. They didn't need guards on every farm. They didn't need overseers with whips at every granary, because the fear was inside them. Generations of psychological torture had created a population too broken to rise, too traumatized to dream, too hollow to hope. The helots didn't just suffer. They believed their suffering was righteous, part of a cosmic order that could never be changed. And while they lived in terror, the Spartans thrived. They didn't invent. They didn't build. They simply took. Every feast, every shield, every sword, built on stolen time and stolen lives. This wasn't just oppression. This was economic vampirism. The Spartans turned misery into a resource, weaponized poverty, and treated human beings as raw material to be mined until empty. And yet, somehow, we still call them heroic. Ask the average person what made Sparta great and they'll likely say, their army, the phalanx, the discipline, the warriors in red cloaks standing unshaken against Persian hordes. But that image, the noble Spartan warrior defending freedom, is a fabrication. A legend polished by centuries of propaganda. The Spartan military wasn't forged to defend liberty. It was forged to maintain internal terror, a permanent war machine aimed not outward but inward. The Spartans didn't fight to conquer empires. They fought to control slaves. Their battlefield was their own land. Their enemy? The helots, the people they had stolen, crushed, and feared. Every polished bronze helmet was part of a domestic surveillance state. Every training exercise, a rehearsal for crushing rebellion. Yes, they fought wars abroad. But their primary mission was always the same: make sure the oppressed stayed afraid. Their tactics weren't designed for efficiency. They were designed for terror. They would starve out cities rather than storm them. Let civilians rot behind walls, watching their children die slowly. They tortured prisoners not for information but as spectacles of pain. And when cities surrendered, they executed men en masse not because they had to, but because they wanted to send a message. They didn't just want obedience. They wanted psychological submission. Even their most celebrated military moment, the Battle of Thermopylae, wasn't quite the glorious tale it's made out to be. Yes, Leonidas and his 300 Spartans held the pass against overwhelming Persian numbers. But it wasn't some romantic sacrifice. It was a calculated delay, a political move by a king who knew the cost, and didn't care. The 300 weren't volunteers for noble death. They were offered up as acceptable losses by a state that had always viewed its soldiers as expendable. Their lives were traded for time. And in Sparta, time always belonged to the state. The Spartan ideal wasn't about courage or justice. It was about obedience without question, cruelty without conscience. They weren't trained to win wars. They were trained to commit atrocities and feel nothing. Even their physical conditioning was part of a larger psychological project. Strip the warrior of empathy, of identity, of anything that might make him hesitate before plunging a spear into a fellow human being. It worked. By the time they marched into battle, Spartan soldiers weren't men. They were tools, precise, polished, and morally empty. And when their numbers began to decline, When Sparta began to run out of warriors, they didn't reform. They didn't adapt. They simply doubled down on the same brutality that had sustained them for centuries. The tragedy wasn't that the Spartan military failed. The tragedy was that it succeeded for so long, that a system so rooted in violence, fear, and human degradation could thrive in the ancient world, and still be admired today. By the 4th century BCE, Sparta was no longer a rising force. It was a decaying machine rotting from the inside out. The same violence that had made it powerful now made it brittle, inflexible, paranoid, unsustainable. This was not a fall brought on by foreign conquest. It was suicide by ideology. Every generation of Spartans lost more men than it produced. Why? Because their system was never built to last, only to dominate. They had engineered a world where only a tiny elite held full citizenship, and that elite was expected to endure endless wars, endless policing of the helots, endless sacrifice for the state. Each generation became smaller, while the enslaved helot population continued to grow. Every uprising was bloodier. Every rebellion more desperate. And to crush those rebellions, Sparta had to sacrifice more of its own youth. A vicious cycle that bled the very core of the state dry. The rigid laws that had once ensured control now made adaptation impossible. Other Greek city-states embraced innovation, expanding trade, building navies, forging alliances. Sparta? It clung to an outdated system of land ownership and military caste, terrified of change. And economically, Sparta was crumbling. It didn't produce. It didn't trade. It didn't invent. Its wealth came from helot labor, but as uprisings multiplied and the population of Spartan warriors thinned, the helots became harder to control. Fear alone wasn't enough. Their isolation, once a symbol of pride, had become a death sentence. And in this vacuum of power and relevance, even their myth collapsed. The final insult? Rome. By the 1st century BCE, Sparta, the once feared terror of the ancient world, had become a tourist attraction for Roman elites. Wealthy Romans would visit to watch the descendants of the 300 perform mock rituals, a sanitized parody of their ancestors' brutality. The fearsome warriors had become actors. Their red cloaks and war chants were now props in a theater of nostalgia. Sparta didn't fall with a bang. It withered, reduced to a living museum, a fossil of its own cruelty. But their ideas, those didn't die. The Spartan model of control, fear, dehumanization, propaganda, and obedience would echo across history, not as noble inspiration, but as a blueprint for oppression. By the 4th century BCE, Sparta, once feared, once revered, began to rot from the inside. It wasn't a foreign invasion that brought them down. It was the very brutality they had institutionalized, the same cruelty that had made them powerful, now consuming them from within. The system they'd spent centuries perfecting, a society fueled by fear, obedience, and systemic violence, had no flexibility, no room for change, no tolerance for weakness. And when history began to shift, Sparta stood frozen, like a statue cracking under its own weight. The crack started with blood. Decades of helot resistance had cost them dearly. The constant need for suppression drained their warrior caste. Each new generation had fewer true Spartan citizens, those born to rule, to fight, to dominate. And the helots? They kept multiplying. Soon the ratio was no longer 10-1. It was closer to 20-30. The balance that had always tilted in Sparta's favor had now become a ticking time bomb. The system's genius had always been in its simplicity, rule through terror. But terror has a cost. The constant cycle of training killers, of patrolling villages, of murdering potential leaders, it was exhausting. And more importantly, unsustainable. The demographic time bomb exploded quietly. There were simply not enough Spartans left. Add to this the economic decline. While Athens, Corinth, and Thebes were embracing trade, currency, and alliances, Sparta stayed chained to its archaic ideals. They had banned the use of gold and silver coins, clinging to a worthless iron currency. They had forbidden trade, distrusted wealth, and demonized personal success. But the world outside was changing fast. Other Greek states were growing richer, more innovative. They could now hire mercenaries, build ships, and launch campaigns far beyond Spartan reach. Sparta, once dominant, was now economically crippled, militarily overstretched, and politically irrelevant. Internally, the decay was visible. The number of full Spartan citizens, those who had survived the age, who owned land, who were allowed to vote, had dwindled to the hundreds. Literally. A ruling class of a few hundred men trying to hold down tens of thousands. And they were no longer young lions. They were aging veterans, outnumbered, outpaced, and completely disconnected from the world they once ruled. The final insult? Sparta became a museum. Roman tourists, centuries later, would come to Laconia to see the ruins of the great warrior state. They paid to watch Spartan youths perform mock rituals, sanitized reenactments of the Krypteia and the Agoge. Children who once murdered helots under the cover of night now acted out their ancestors' atrocities as part of public shows. The descendants of killers had become actors. The red cloaks were still worn, but now as costumes. The same city that once stood as the embodiment of fear and power was now a tragic parody of itself, an exhibit for foreign amusement. Sparta didn't die in a blaze of glory. It didn't fall to an epic siege or a final rebellion. It withered, slowly, quietly. The machine they built to control others had no mechanism to evolve. It was all knife, no hand. All spine, no brain. When the world demanded change, Sparta offered only discipline. When the world moved forward, they dug deeper into the past. Their brutality, once an advantage, became a prison. But even in its death, Sparta cast a long shadow. Their methods didn't disappear. They metastasized. The fall of Sparta didn't begin with war. It began with rot from within. By the 4th century BCE, the very system that had made Sparta dominant began to devour itself. The relentless brutality, once seen as the key to power, had eroded the very foundations of Spartan society. The constant pressure to maintain absolute control over the helots drained the state's strength. Spartan warriors were not conquering new lands, they were constantly extinguishing fires at home. And with every helot uprising crushed, another Spartan bled out in the dirt. Their own population was shrinking. Not from foreign invasion but from the sheer brutality of their system. For a civilization that demanded perfection, even birth itself became a liability. The Spartan obsession with racial purity and physical dominance had left them with a demographic crisis. Fewer and fewer male citizens were deemed fit to join the military ranks. The process of inspection and exposure had culled generations. And those who survived the Agoge emerged so psychologically damaged, many could not form families or even function outside a military context. Sparta, once feared as an empire of warriors, now faced an enemy it could not defeat, extinction by design. Meanwhile, the world around them evolved. Trade flourished. New weapons and military tactics emerged. Diplomacy and innovation began shaping power in the Greek world. But Sparta was trapped, chained to the myth of its own invincibility. It couldn't adapt, wouldn't compromise. And as other states adapted, Sparta stayed rigid and broke. The great irony? The very cruelty that had once made them strong was now making them obsolete. Spartans had no merchant class, no craftsmen, no thinkers. They had reduced their entire civilization to one narrow function, to kill or die trying. But a state can't survive on blood alone. And so the decline wasn't a blaze of glory, it was a slow suffocation. As wealth accumulated in the hands of fewer and fewer Spartans, inequality deepened. The once feared army became smaller. Helots became bolder. The elite grew paranoid, dividing land among themselves while the economy collapsed. In a desperate move, Sparta tried to reform, tried to increase citizenship by relaxing the harsh codes that defined their people. But it was too late. The machine had eaten too much of itself. Then came the final humiliation. By the time the Romans arrived, Sparta was no longer a warrior state. It was a theme park for imperial tourists. The rituals of pain and control once used to dominate were now staged performances for the amusement of foreigners. Spartan youths demonstrated mock training exercises. Elders reenacted ancient rites. The state that had once hunted its own children in the night was now begging Rome for attention, a relic of cruelty dressed in ceremonial costume. The same society that once defined strength now existed only as spectacle. But Sparta's influence didn't die with its last citizen. It mutated. The techniques of surveillance, indoctrination, and psychological control didn't vanish. They simply changed uniforms. Spartan methodology became the blueprint for every totalitarian regime to come, from Roman slave masters to Nazi death camps, from gulags to modern police states. Their systems of cruelty were studied, improved, and deployed. The Spartans may have vanished, but their ghost lives on. In every society that glorifies order over empathy. In every institution that conditions obedience over conscience. In every culture that teaches children to kill before they can cry. Sparta whispers. It whispers that brutality is strength, that fear is stability, that cruelty is destiny. But perhaps the most chilling echo of Sparta is how easily it convinces others to follow. Sparta died, but the virus it created didn't. It spread, not in name but in method, in ideology, in systems. Spartan cruelty didn't perish with its last warrior. It metastasized into empires, colonies, concentration camps, and modern police states. The blueprint the Spartans perfected: population control through fear, the institutional destruction of empathy, obedience enforced by ritualized brutality, would become the foundation for every authoritarian regime in history. From the Roman slave economy to medieval serfdom. From colonial empires carving up continents to the gas chambers of the 20th century. You can trace the bones of Spartan thinking. A belief that humans are resources. That control justifies cruelty. That conformity is peace and dissent is disease. The very techniques that once trained boys to murder without question now live on in systems that silence protest, criminalize compassion, and label empathy as weakness. What Sparta engineered was more than a city, it was a psychological framework. A culture where virtue meant submission. Where questioning power was heresy. Where suffering wasn't a tragedy, it was a tool. Modern tyrannies did not invent their playbooks. They inherited them from men in bronze who worshipped discipline but feared change. Think of North Korea, its rigid control over education, speech, and even thought. Think of Nazi Germany, its cult of strength, eugenics, racial purity. Or the Khmer Rouge, ripping children from families, turning neighbors into spies, and purging the educated. All echoes of Sparta. And yet, pop culture still worships the myth. We remember the chiseled bodies, the slow-motion battles, the quotes about freedom, uttered by men who enslaved entire populations and murdered children for state purity. This is Sparta, they scream. No, that was Sparta. A society so obsessed with control it consumed itself. So afraid of change, it chose extinction. So hollowed out by its own rituals of pain, that all it left behind was a romantic illusion, a lie wrapped in muscle and blood. And it's not just a historical misunderstanding. It's a dangerous one. Because when we mythologize Sparta, we normalize its methods. When schools praise Spartan discipline, when politicians invoke Spartan values, when movies paint them as tragic heroes, we inch closer to accepting what should horrify us. The real Spartans didn't defend freedom. They annihilated it. They didn't value strength. They engineered obedience. And their legacy survives not in glory, but in every institution where cruelty becomes culture. In every government that demands loyalty through fear. In every system that teaches a child to dehumanize before they can even read. Sparta may be dust, but its ideas still breathe. In prisons. In military academies. In the quiet offices where laws are written to surveil, to punish, to disappear. They taught the world that if you crush a child early enough, you don't need chains to keep them loyal. What makes Sparta truly terrifying isn't what it did to its enemies. It's what it did to its own people. How it reached into the human soul, found the instinct for compassion, and crushed it before it could bloom. How it taught generations to not only accept brutality, but to administer it with pride. Sparta didn't rely on brute force alone. It didn't need to. Its greatest achievement wasn't military, it was psychological. It built a machine where victims became executioners, where pain was heritage, and where the greatest honor was to sacrifice others, and yourself, for the glory of a system that treated everyone as disposable. The boy who was torn from his mother at 7, became the teenager who hunted men in the night. The girl taught to shame compassion, became the mother who cheered her son's death in war. The helot forced to praise his master, taught his children to fear hope. And so the cycle turned. Oppression became inheritance. Cruelty became culture. Survival became complicity. The Spartans didn't just rule through violence. They ruled through internalized obedience, generation after generation conditioned to believe that their suffering was necessary, that their fear was loyalty, that their silence was strength. That is the real horror. Not the blood spilled in battle, but the minds reprogrammed to love their chains. Sparta didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because it was rigid. Because it built its society on fear, not resilience. On conformity, not imagination. When the world changed, Sparta couldn't. Its people, trained to obey, had forgotten how to adapt. Its warriors, trained to kill, had forgotten how to build. Its leaders, raised on paranoia, had forgotten how to trust. The state that produced the most feared killers in the ancient world died not with a scream but a shrug. And yet its methods live on. Whenever a government declares war on its own citizens in the name of order, whenever a child is taught that obedience matters more than empathy, whenever systems reward brutality and punish kindness, Sparta breathes again. You may not see the red cloaks. You may not hear the battle cries. But the architecture is still there, hidden in legislation, in surveillance, in social hierarchies. So remember this. The Spartans weren't great because they were fearless. They were terrifying because they were afraid. Afraid of change, of rebellion, of freedom. And in their fear they built a system so cruel that even death couldn't kill it. What they started didn't end with them. It echoes in the darkest corners of our civilization. And unless we recognize it, unless we name it and reject it, it will continue to echo. In schools, in prisons, in policies, in minds. Sparta is dead, but its ghost still hunts us.